If you look at the world today, everyone is talking about the rivalry between the United States and China. We hear about trade wars, tech bans, and economic containment. The narrative is always the same. A rising power challenges the existing superpower, and the superpower fights back. But what if I told you we have seen this movie before? What if I told you that 40 years ago there was another Asian country that was about to overtake America? A country that was buying up New York City, dominating the tech world, and making American CEOs tremble in their offices. That country was not China. It was Japan. In the 1980s, Japan was unstoppable. They were the economic miracle of the 20th century. But then, almost overnight, it all stopped. The economy crashed, the growth vanished, and Japan entered what economists call the lost decades. For the last 30 years, Japan has been stagnant. Most history books will tell you this was just bad luck or a natural economic cycle. But there is another story, a darker story. It is the story of a secret meeting in a luxury hotel in New York City. A meeting where America's greatest ally was forced to sign its own economic death warrant. This is the story of the Plaza Accord, and how the United States assassinated the economy of its closest friend to save itself. To understand this conspiracy, we have to go back to the 1980s. If you weren't alive then, it is hard to imagine just how powerful Japan was. Today we think of Silicon Valley as the center of technology, but in the 80s, the center of the world was Tokyo. Companies like Sony, Panasonic, Toyota, and Honda were eating American industry alive. American cars were seen as junk, unreliable, gas-guzzling monsters, while Japanese cars were sleek, efficient, and high-tech. The American public was terrified. There was a genuine fear that Japan was going to buy the entire United States. And it wasn't just paranoia, it was actually happening. In 1989, Mitsubishi Estate bought the Rockefeller Center in New York. This was a national monument, a symbol of American capitalism, and it was now owned by the Japanese. Sony bought Columbia Pictures in Hollywood. The message was clear. America makes the movies, but Japan owns the studio. By the mid-1980s, Japan's GDP was growing so fast that experts predicted it would surpass the United States by the year 2000. Japan was the world's largest creditor nation. The United States was the world's largest debtor nation. The tables had turned. The student had become the master. In Washington, panic set in. The mood was ugly. American politicians were smashing Toshiba radios on the lawn of the Capitol building with sledgehammers. They gave angry speeches about the yellow peril. They claimed Japan was cheating. They said Japan wasn't playing by the rules. Does this sound familiar? It is the exact same language used against China today. But remember, Japan wasn't a communist rival. Japan was a democracy. Japan was America's military ally. But in the game of empires, there are no friends. There are only interests. The problem for the United States was the trade deficit. Americans were buying billions of dollars of Japanese goods, But Japanese people weren't buying American goods. Why? Because American goods were too expensive, and Japanese goods were high quality and cheap. The reason for this was the currency. The US dollar was very strong. The Japanese yen was very weak. When the dollar is strong, it's great for American tourists traveling abroad. But it is a disaster for American factories. It makes American exports expensive and foreign imports cheap. US manufacturers, the car makers in Detroit, the steel mills in Pennsylvania, were screaming for help. They told President Ronald Reagan that if he didn't stop Japan, American industry would die. So the US government decided to intervene. They didn't fix their own factories. They didn't improve their own quality. Instead, they decided to break the Japanese yen. The date was September 22nd, 1985. The location was the Plaza Hotel in New York City. The finance ministers and central bank governors of the world's 5 biggest economies, the US, UK, France, West Germany, and Japan, gathered for a secret meeting. The goal was simple: devalue the US dollar. The plan was for all these countries to manipulate the currency markets, to lower the value of the dollar, and drastically increase the value of the Japanese yen and the German mark. Now you might ask, why would Japan agree to this? Why would they agree to make their own currency more expensive? A stronger yen meant that Sony and Toyota would have to charge much more for their products in America. It meant their sales would drop. It was essentially an agreement to sabotage their own export economy. The answer lies in geopolitics. Japan was an economic giant, but a military dwarf. Since World War II, Japan relied entirely on the United States for its defense. They had American bases on their soil. When the superpower that protects you demands a signature, you sign. The US threatened protectionist laws. They threatened to ban Japanese imports completely if Japan didn't cooperate. Japan felt they had no choice. They hoped that by agreeing to the Plaza Accord, they would appease the American anger and keep their relationship safe. So they signed. And the effects were immediate. In just 2 years, the value of the US dollar collapsed by 50% against the yen. The yen skyrocketed. Suddenly, Japanese products became twice as expensive in the United States. American consumers stopped buying as many Japanese TVs and cars. Japanese export profits vanished overnight. Factories in Japan started to struggle. The engine of the Japanese economy, exports, was brutally cut off. If the story ended there, it would just be a story about a bad trade deal. But the Plaza Accord triggered a chain reaction that was much, much worse. This is where the conspiracy turns into a tragedy. Faced with a sudden drop in exports caused by the Plaza Accord, the Japanese government panicked. They needed to stimulate their economy to keep it from crashing. To do this, the Bank of Japan lowered interest rates to historic lows. They flooded the market with cheap cash. They wanted Japanese companies to borrow money and invest at home, since they couldn't sell as much abroad. But when you flood a country with cheap money, that money has to go somewhere. It didn't go into factories, it went into speculation. It went into the stock market and real estate. This created the legendary bubble economy of the late 1980s. For a few years, it looked like a party. Tokyo real estate prices became insane. There is a famous statistic from that time. The land under the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was worth more than all the real estate in the entire state of California combined. Japanese people felt rich. They were buying art, gold, and golf club memberships for millions of dollars. But it was a fake prosperity. It was a financial hallucination fueled by the panic response to the Plaza Accord. The foundation of the economy, manufacturing and exports, had been damaged, and this financial bubble was just covering up the wound. By 1990, the bubble became too big to sustain. The Bank of Japan realized things were out of control and tried to stop it by raising interest rates. But it was too late. The bubble didn't just leak, it exploded. The stock market crashed. Real estate prices fell by 60, 70, sometimes 80%. People who had borrowed millions to buy apartments were suddenly bankrupt. Banks were left with trillions of yen in bad loans that would never be repaid. The economy ground to a halt. This was the beginning of the lost decades. While America boomed in the 1990s with the Internet age, Japan suffocated. Salaries froze. Innovation slowed down. The vibrant, aggressive Japan of the 1980s turned into a country of stagnation, deflation, and old age. Japan has never truly recovered its #1 spot. The threat to American dominance was neutralized. Many historians will tell you this was just Japan's mistake. They will say Japan managed its monetary policy poorly, and that is partially true. But we have to look at the root cause. None of this would have happened without the Plaza Accord. The pressure to restructure the currency came from Washington. The demand to fix the trade imbalance came from Washington. The United States weaponized the global financial system to handicap a competitor. It is a perfect example of how a superpower maintains its position. It doesn't always use tanks and missiles. Sometimes it uses exchange rates and trade deals. The Plaza Accord taught the world a brutal lesson. Becoming an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but becoming a successful economic rival to the United States, even if you are an ally, can be fatal. The United States solved its problem. The US economy boomed in the 90s. The threat of a Japanese century was deleted from history. But the consequences for the Japanese people were devastating. A generation of young people in Japan grew up in a stagnant economy, unable to find full-time jobs, calling themselves the lost generation. The social contract of lifetime employment was broken. The suicide rates increased. The optimism of the post-war era died. Why does this matter today? Why should you care about a document signed in 1985? Because history is repeating itself. Look at the headlines. Replace the word Japan with China. The script is almost identical. Today, China is the manufacturing powerhouse. Today, the US complains about a massive trade deficit. Today, the US accuses the rival of currency manipulation and unfair state subsidies. Today, the US is using sanctions, tariffs, and export bans to slow down the rival's technological growth. The attempt to ban Huawei is the modern version of smashing Toshiba radios. The chip war, to stop China from getting semiconductors, is the modern version of the Plaza Accord. The goal is the same: to force the rising power to change its economic structure, to open its markets, and to stop challenging American dominance. However, there is one major difference. Japan was a military protectorate of the US. They had no choice but to say yes. China is a sovereign military power with its own nuclear arsenal. They have studied history. They know exactly what happened to Japan. Chinese state media and economists frequently talk about the Plaza Accord. For them, it is a cautionary tale. It is the ultimate proof that you cannot trust the West to play fair. They believe that if they compromise, if they open up their financial system too fast, if they let the US dictate their currency value, they will suffer the same fate as Tokyo. They will face their own lost decades. This is why the current trade war is so difficult to resolve. It's not just about money. It's about survival. Beijing looks at the Plaza Accord and sees a trap. Washington looks at the Plaza Accord and sees a playbook that worked. The Plaza Accord was sold to the world as a diplomatic triumph, a moment of international cooperation. But in reality, it was a cold-blooded, calculated move to dismantle a competitor. It reminds us that in the world of geopolitics, economics is just war by other means. Japan played the game, followed the rules, and rose to the top. But they forgot the most important rule of all. The house always wins. And when the house starts losing, they change the rules. Japan never saw it coming. The question is, will the next challenger be different? Or is the global financial system designed to ensure that only one king sits on the throne? The tragedy of the Plaza Accord isn't just a story about exchange rates. It's a story about hubris and betrayal. It is a reminder that national sovereignty is fragile, and economic independence is the only true freedom. Japan lost theirs in a hotel room in 1985, and the world is still feeling the aftershocks today.